Welcome to this explainer. When we think of the Great Depression, we usually picture American soup lines or the Dust Bowl. But today, we're taking a world tour to uncover how it wasn't just an American tragedy. It was a massive, virtually unstoppable global contagion. We're going to see how a shockwave that started in the United States rippled outward, touching the poorest regions of Africa and Asia just as violently as it hit the wealthiest capitals of Europe. It's an incredible story of global interconnectedness, and it literally reshaped the world we live in today. Here's our agenda for today. We're going to start with the fragile global web, move right into the American epicenter, and trace the contagion across the continents. Then we'll look at the exploited colonies, a Japanese masterclass in economic recovery, and finally wrap up with the modern economic legacy. Let's dive in. All right, Section 1, a fragile global web. This is all about the interconnected world of the 1920s. So picture the world right before the crash. The United Kingdom was basically championing this worldwide policy of free trade. And what that did was create a highly intertwined system. Countries could easily buy and sell without massive restrictions, tying almost every corner of the globe together into this really delicately balanced web. On one side, you had industrialized nations pumping out cheap manufactured goods from their factories. On the other side, poorer regions were supplying the crops and raw materials. And the United States, well, they were sitting incredibly pretty here. They were industrialized, they'd completely avoided the destruction of World War I on their own soil, and they were just generating massive wealth from this global exchange. Moving on to Section 2, the American epicenter, or how the dominoes fell. Now, flush with all that newfound wealth, Americans started taking out huge bank loans for one specific reason: to buy company stocks. Everyone just kind of assumed prices would rise forever. But then 1929 hit. In literally one single month, the market plummeted. We're talking a wipeout of an astonishing 40% of the value of company shares. 40%. Suddenly, all those borrowers were completely unable to repay their bank loans. And sure, at first glance, you might think, well, the stock market is just one piece of the puzzle, right? But actually, it was the psychological shock of this crash that pulled the trigger on a much larger disaster. This set off a totally devastating domino effect. Let's break it down. Step 1, prices plummet. Step 2, terrified consumers immediately stop buying things because, they're panicking. Step 3, since businesses aren't selling anything, they can't pay their suppliers or their workers, so they're forced to cut costs and fire people. And then, the final blow, Step 4, as unemployed folks default on their mortgages and desperately withdraw whatever savings they have left, the banks literally run out of cash and go bankrupt. This whole cascading failure ultimately led to a staggering 25% unemployment rate in the US. Let that sink in. 1 in every 4 workers had absolutely zero income. And because people were buying way less stuff, but factories were still desperately pumping out goods, trying to pay off their own debts, prices for basic necessities just collapsed. Cotton, for instance, dropped in price by 2/3. It's just wild. Now, the terminology here is actually pretty interesting, mostly because economists are, frankly, notorious for being terrible at naming things. Officially, a recession is just 2 consecutive quarters where an economy produces fewer products. It doesn't even matter if it shrinks by a single dollar. That's a recession. But this specific downturn, it was so horrific, so unbelievably deep, that economists basically just threw their hands up and gave it the permanent dramatic title of the Great Depression. Okay, Section 3, contagion across the continents. Let's look at Latin America and Europe. Because of that fragile, interconnected web we talked about earlier, the American crisis didn't stay American for long. It instantly spilled over the borders. Take Latin American economies, for example. They were heavily reliant on exporting primary goods. We're talking stuff that doesn't need a manufacturing process: coffee beans, copper, meat, things like that. But when the Great Depression hit, their biggest customers in Europe and the US suddenly couldn't afford to buy any of it. As a result, the prices for these Latin American exports absolutely collapsed, dropping anywhere from 50 to 66% between 1928 and 1932. It brought just massive unemployment and crushing poverty to the entire region. And to artificially control these plunging prices, some governments tried incredibly desperate measures. Get this, to stop the surplus from devaluing the market even further, the Brazilian government actually resorted to destroying their own products. Throughout the 1930s, they burned an unbelievable 60 million bags of coffee. To put that insane number into perspective, that is the equivalent of roughly 2 full years of global coffee consumption, literally just going up in smoke. It's almost hard to wrap your head around. Meanwhile, over in Europe, the situation was uniquely tragic. They were already severely weakened by World War I. They were busy trying to rebuild. And they were completely saddled with immense war debts and reparations. So when the Great Depression crossed the Atlantic, Europe's banking system, which relied on a few massive centralized banks rather than smaller local ones, was just totally devastated. And their attempts to solve the crash, well, they were pretty disastrous. They pushed strict austerity, cut spending, and slapped tariffs on everything, which really only deepened the poverty. Eventually, this actually pushed many nations to heavily invest in their militaries, just as a desperate way to boost industrial output. Which brings us to Section 4, the exploited colonies. Let's head over to Africa and Asia. So while independent nations were scrambling to adjust tariffs or print money, the highly colonized continents of Africa and Asia were facing a much darker nightmare. It was a vicious cycle we can call the colonial trap. See, locals were forced to pay colonial taxes, and those taxes had to be paid in the currency of their European overlords. But to get that specific currency, they were forced to grow cash crops for export instead of, actually growing their own food. So when global agricultural prices absolutely tanked because of the Depression, millions of locals suddenly couldn't pay their colonial taxes. The fallout from this was brutal: rampant poverty, mass evictions, and desperate uprisings that were, tragically, fiercely suppressed by colonial authorities. However, there was this absolutely fascinating anomaly in Asia. While most of the world was stubbornly clinging to the gold standard, which meant their currencies were rigidly tied to gold reserves, severely limiting their ability to print money, British India and China were actually on the silver standard. And because the global price of silver dropped during the Depression, the value of their currency dropped right along with it. This meant their exported goods instantly became way cheaper and much easier to sell globally. So they actually survived the initial wave of the Depression significantly better than Europe, all thanks to this wild silver loophole. All right, Section 5, the Japanese Masterclass. This is a blueprint for recovery. While Europe and the US were stumbling around blindly with severe austerity measures, Japan's finance minister, a man named Takahashi Korekiya, decided not to just wait for things to magically fix themselves. Instead, he executed a completely proactive four-step masterclass. First, he immediately abandoned the restrictive gold standard. Second, he fired up the presses and printed more money. Third, he intentionally devalued the Japanese yen so foreign countries would rush in to buy super cheap Japanese exports. And finally, he channeled massive government support directly into transitioning the country toward highly profitable heavy industry. This ended up preserving jobs and basically creating industrial giants overnight. And what's truly amazing about this is that Takahashi's brilliant policies heavily predated the work of the famous economist John Maynard Keynes, the guy who later wrote the definitive book on getting out of the Great Depression. Takahashi laid out the exact blueprint that modern governments literally still use today to drag economies out of recessions. History just kind of ended up naming the strategy after Keynes, rather than the guy who actually hit the nail on the head and implemented it first. And finally, Section 6, the modern economic legacy, out of the ashes. As we conclude our world tour, we really have to look at how this global catastrophe permanently reshaped our baseline expectations of what a government and a society are actually supposed to do. You see, when people collectively hit rock bottom, they become incredibly open to the greatest, most structural changes. Those modern safety nets we completely take for granted today, governments stepping in to stabilize a crashing economy, providing healthcare, offering financial aid to the unemployed or disabled, all of that was born directly from the desperate, urgent solutions forged in the 1930s. Before the Great Depression, these concepts were virtually non-existent on a national scale. It was a total game changer. In fact, looking back at that whole era, unless you were living in the heavily isolated, tightly controlled Soviet Union, which basically wasn't participating in global trade anyway, the only continent on Earth that was totally fine and completely untouched by the Great Depression was Antarctica. Well, assuming you managed to avoid any ancient Lovecraftian ruins hidden in the ice, of course. Which leaves us with one final thought to ponder as we wrap up this explainer. We just saw how a stock crash in New York caused coffee to be burned in Brazil and colonial farmers to be evicted in Africa, all because of a globalized trade web. So considering our international trade network is infinitely more intertwined today than it ever was in 1929, are we really immune to another massive global chain reaction? It's definitely something to think about. Thanks so much for joining me on this deep dive.